you to this beautiful day for our annual Literature in the Courtyard program. I know I don't need to tell anyone here just how special a place the Johann Fust Library buildings and gardens are. As I look at all of you, I see a lot of familiar faces, including many of you who are longtime friends and supporters. Next season, the Johann Fust Library Foundation will be asking you to help us celebrate 75 years of the Island Library. Some of you here have played an important role in that history. One of those is Cotton Hanley. Cotton is a former board president, and thanks to a very generous gift from Cotton, this is our 4th Literature in the Courtyard program. It was Cotton's wish that each year the community would be invited into the library courtyard to hear a writer of acclaim. The first year was 2022, and it featured an acclaimed writer, Tom McGuane. That year, Tom was in conversation with former board president John Cleghorn, who is here with us today. In 2023, we welcomed Anna Quinlan. Anna was in conversation with board member emerita Alice Gorman. Last year, we were fortunate to have journalist and royal biographer Sally Bedell Smith, and she was in conversation with our board member Linda Fairstein. And today, our writer of acclaim is Hampton Sides, who will be introduced by Alice Gorman and will be in conversation with Tom McGuane. Cotton, thank you for your gift, allowing us to invite Hampton Sides to be here today. The only problem with having Hampton here with Tom McGuane is that staff members Bobby and Julianne had to tell a lot of people there was a long wait list for today. Tom and Alice, thank you for participating for the 2nd time in the Literature of Courtyard series. And to Alice and to Linda Fairstein and fellow foundation board members Louise Nadler and Peter Sherwood for being our book sponsors for today. Thanks to them, you all have received a copy of The Wide, Wide Sea. If you've already read it like I have, you're probably thinking, Cappy, please sit down. We want to hear Tom talking to Hampton. If you haven't read it yet, I bet you will be wanting to start reading your copy of The Wide, Wide Sea as soon as you leave here today.
Good.
I know you all want to hear the speakers, but you have to listen to me first. There's an old saying that behind every successful man is a surprised mother-in-law. But I want to change that a little bit and say that beside every successful man is an extraordinary woman. And in this case, it's Ann Sides and Laurie McGuane. Will you all stand up? Okay. Today, we are so privileged to be witnesses to an unprecedented historic literary event. This conversation between 2 of America's most prominent contemporary literary figures. Hampton Sides, a nonfiction writer who was referred to in The New Yorker as one of the great narrative nonfiction writers of our time. And Tom McGuane, a master fiction writer who has been called the pool shark of prose. Both of these exceptional authors have an endless list of accomplishments and honors. Hampton's extraordinary career is listed on the back of your program, so I won't repeat it. Tom McGuane, who beside holding a Wallace Stegner Fellowship at Stanford and membership in the American Academy of Arts and Letters, has published some 170 works, translated into 12 languages, and found in over 470 publications. So, what is it about these two authors that has made them so prominent in the literary world today? An interviewer once asked Tom, "What does it take to be a writer?" He answered, "It's a love of literature itself, a love of reading, a love of books. That's the first thing. Without it, one cannot go on." In Hampton's case, he was born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, a place full of history and stories. One of his best friends growing up was the son of Shelby Foote, the great Southern writer, and he spent many nights in their house and listening to Shelby. Hampton's first job as a writer after his graduation from Yale was an assignment from Memphis Magazine to interview Shelby. I happen to know the editor of the Memphis Magazine, who told me himself that he knew from that interview nearly 30 years ago the genius of Hampton's writing was obvious even then. One of Hampton's questions to Shelby for that interview is the same question that many of us might ask today. What do you think the discipline of writing is any different, the narrative history of writing is any different from the discipline of writing fiction? Shelby's answer was, "I really don't. There are obvious differences. You can't say Lincoln had gray eyes if he didn't. In my fiction, I always decided what color a man's eyes were, what shape his fingernails were, what kind of tie he wore. In writing history, it didn't bother me a bit to have to look them up instead of imagining them. So either way, I'd end up with the same approach." To prove that theory, when you read a Tom McGuane short story or one of his novels, all of his characters, you appear as if they are absolutely real people. In Hampton's narrative nonfiction, and particularly his book, The Wide, Wide Sea, you will see his portrayal of the protagonist, Captain Cook, as if he were standing in front of you. Each of these two authors write riveting stories. What sort of questions do you think they would ask each other? We are very lucky to be here to find out. So please welcome Hampton Sides and Tom McGuane.
Wow, you knocked it out of the park. I would have to say, after that introduction, my first impulse is to find somebody in the audience who will go to the bank and sign a note for me. I want to make a few remarks. I know all of you just got the book just a few minutes ago, and if unless you're speed readers, some of you haven't read it yet. My own encounter with this book was based on opening and closing a lot of books I couldn't seem to finish in these turbulent times, and I was looking for a book that would keep me from reading the news. And when I opened this book, I was off and running. I haven't even looked at my phone. It's a superb piece of narrative nonfiction, and I can't recommend it enough. I dare you to open page 1 and make your plans from there. I borrowed these glasses. They're Barbie style, but I need them. I want to set the stage for this great book a little bit for those of you, especially those of you who haven't read it yet. It's about, as you can tell, Cook's third voyage basically around the world, from the shores of the Antarctic to the shores of the Arctic Ocean. It's an unbelievable human achievement. But to set it in context, I'll tell you a little bit about what the plan was originally. Instructions from the Admiralty with George III hovering in the background. And those of you who know your English history know that George III was a master at hovering. And Lord Sandwich, who was the head of the Admiralty, was seemingly a real Enlightenment figure, a very forceful guy. But so Cook had several instructions. First of all, he was to return a Polynesian native who had been in England for how long? A year?
A little more than 2 years.
Okay. And he really sank into English life. He dressed like an Englishman. He went to plays. He went to museums. He wandered around. He made lots and lots of friends. He seduced the wives of aristocrats. But it was time for him to go home, back to Polynesia. The first order of business was to take Omai and deliver him to Tahiti. The second was to claim lands for England with, and this is significant, quote, the consent of the natives. This was the Enlightenment, so they believed that at the time. He was to sail north in search of the Northwest Passage and go as far as 65 degrees north latitude, which put him in the Arctic Ocean. It was the end of the 7 Years' War. The American Revolution was just getting underway. And I'd like Hampton to comment on this. It's surprising they would even want to do this at a time when the colonies were rebelling. France and England are still adversaries, and they all still believe that you could claim new lands, new continents even, by putting the king's name on a piece of paper, putting it in a bottle, and burying it under a tree. So imperialism was just peaking up, and one of the things I want to talk to Hampton about is whether this was really an imperialist adventure, or if it was an Enlightenment adventure to add to the world's knowledge. So let's start with that, Hampton, because that kind of rules the narrative a little bit, I think.
Yeah, let me see if I can get this off of here. Thank you so much. First, Alice, for that wonderful introduction. I have to say that I feel like I've really hit the big time now, because I had a policeman out there directing traffic. It's first time that's ever happened to me. I also feel like I've hit the big time to be up here on a stage with the great Tom McGuane, bull shark of prose. I feel I sort of have imposter syndrome to be with you. It's an honor and a privilege to have a chat with you in this amazing, beautiful place that we've been to a couple of times. I guess I was here, what was it, about 8 years ago, and did a talk in the library. And I guess I didn't offend too many people because you invited me back, and my wife as well. So good to be here. So yeah, that third voyage, and really you could say all three of his voyages around the world, did have this kind of interesting mix between the Enlightenment, the search for knowledge, the attempt to explore lands and describe species of animals and plants that had never been seen by Europeans, and to publish all this stuff and get the places fixed on maps that were also published. That was the sort of Enlightenment part. And then the imperialist part, which is carving up lands, claiming them for the crown, competing with the French and the Russians and the Dutch and the Spanish to own the world. Both of those things, both of those impulses were, I think, equally driving this thing. And Cook kind of had to wear both hats, sometimes at the same time. the part that he loved, the part that really animated him, the part that I think you really see his journals come alive is when he's being the Enlightenment explorer and the sort of proto anthropologist, describing people. We get our first descriptions of the Maori and of the Hawaiians and certain other Polynesian cultures, and he's not judgmental. He's like taking notes and describing what they wear. This is what they eat. This is how they worship their gods. You don't see the word like savages in there. He's never trying to convert them to Christianity. He really is kind of an Enlightenment explorer, and simultaneously creating these incredibly beautiful and accurate charts that put these places on the map, and ultimately kind of destroy these places because now they're on maps, and the other people can come later and find and sort of sully these paradises that have been discovered. But then he has to put that other hat on and go ashore and do these ridiculous ceremonies where they claim it for the king, and they, as you said, put a piece of paper in a bottle and voila, it's ours now. And it seems so silly. The consent of the natives, yeah, well, they couldn't talk to the natives. They didn't speak the same language usually. So, actually, Cook and his men did learn a fair amount of Polynesian over the course of his voyages. But, okay, let's say they go to Alaska and they raise the Union Jack and they claim it for England, and the natives are watching, and they're not giving their consent. They don't even know what's happening. There's some wigged monarch, 8,000, 10,000 miles away on the other side of the planet is now their lord and, sovereign king. Pretty silly stuff. So, I think you're right in pointing out that both of those impulses are driving these expeditions, and, especially this third one, which involves finding ultimately the final goal, which is to find this Northwest Passage, some sort of shortcut over or through Canada that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, something that the British had been searching for a long time. And now they wanted to try to search for it from the Pacific side, from the Alaskan side. And of course, they never found it. All they found was ice up there. But along the way, he mapped Alaska and gave us some sense of what an extraordinary place that is. I think that's kind of gets at the dual nature of his voyages.
Right, and you had to work through that in your own introduction because we all feel the weight of the current view of colonialism, which is that people like, in this narrow view, people like Cook are just sort of the pointy edge of empire. And I don't think he saw it that way. My sense of this from reading your book is that Cook was driven by curiosity, addiction to voyaging, seeing new things, and then through his cartographic efforts, describing what he had seen, and very little effort to impose English values on the natives. The ship didn't even carry a Bible, so they weren't ready to go into that chapter. But what really struck me about him is how long he attempted to embrace the local native worldview and gradually lost his ability to do that. The floggings increased. His disagreements with the natives increased through the course of this narrative. We're getting a little ahead of this, but in addition to that, he was beginning to make navigational errors, which he had never done before. And it seems to me he was kind of the peerless, sort of pure-hearted adventurer until he wasn't. And when he wasn't, he became a kind of violent character, but it was not on behalf of Imperial Designs. It was just almost a mental problem.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear your theory of that, because I'm not teeing you up for this, because nobody knows why Cook changed.
Right.
But that would be nice to hear your view on that.
Yeah. So it's kind of one of the themes of the book, and one of the themes of the voyage is that something is wrong with the captain. He's not the same guy that we saw in Voyages 1 and 2. And the question was, what was it? Was it medical, like a medical, physical problem? Was it a mental problem? Was it a spiritual problem? The captains of that day, the British Navy included, often were just incredibly brutal. With the lash. And beatings will continue until morale improves. That kind of mentality. And Cook really differentiating himself from those other captains in Voyages 1 and 2, in terms of using the lash and the bread and water treatment and all that kind of stuff. Once they left the port, they were master and commander, and they had absolute authority to do whatever they deemed necessary. But he was quite enlightened in that way. On the third voyage, we see more beatings. We see more cruelty visited upon the natives that he encounters. We see his temper erupt. We see long stretches of moodiness where he is in his cabin alone, depressed. What is it? What is wrong with this guy? And, there have been lots of papers written by doctors, forensic historian, like medical historians who trying to figure out the most likely theory that I think makes sense, that's certainly plausible, is that he had parasites from his Voyages 1 and 2 that had been slowly but surely depleting him of essential vitamins and minerals that can seriously lead to brain damage. And I think that's a very plausible scenario. And I looked into some of these weird diagnoses that you can get, and how many of these horrible parasites you can imagine with the ship conditions he was working with and the food he was eating. It's quite plausible. And I think that is a possibility, a distinct one. When I was on the book tour, a number of psychiatrists came up to me and said, what you're describing is classically what we would today call bipolar disorder. Just very high highs and very low lows, and very moody and depressed, but then horrible temper. In episodes, it came and went. It wasn't constant. And then I did think about it. Well, he went to the Antarctic, he went to the Arctic, so he was bipolar. Sorry, I'm sorry.
No worries.
I'm not a doctor.
You are now.
But I do think there was an element of also he was tired and he was older, and he was for a British captain of that day, he was a little bit past his expiration date, and he was really struggling to hold this thing together. And these voyages are incredibly stressful and difficult enterprises to manage. It's 180 men on 2 ships with all these belongings and all these animals that were on board the ships, getting Mai to his destination, and then getting all the way to Alaska, doing it on a timeline with sort of an understanding that the Admiralty is kind of watching him from afar, wondering, is he going to find this passage? There's just a lot of stress, and perhaps he was just having a kind of a mental breakdown from not 1, not 2, but 3 of these incredible voyages.
Well, we know very little about his interior life from the get-go, correct? I mean, he had a long correspondence with his wife from the time of their courtship, and she destroyed all those letters. That's the closest thing we would have. There's nothing in his journals that gives you much insight to who he actually was as a human being. Right. And I don't know that there was ever episodes of this disorder early, before the voyages, but to give our audience here an idea of what the downside of his bipolar life was like. A goat was stolen from the expedition, and he basically applied a sort of burnt earth to the island of the people who'd stolen the goat. If indeed they had, they kind of didn't have an idea of those such things. They maybe felt they had borrowed the goat, but it was scorched earth. I mean, they burned all the towns and killed all the animals, and then when he went back on the ship, he said, "I hope this wasn't as bad an episode for the people of this island as it was for me." So he had this crazy, free-floating remorse about the worst things he did.
Yeah, that episode that you're talking about really was kind of the most egregious example of this, of whatever it was that was ailing him. Like, his officers couldn't believe that he was leading this scorched earth campaign across the island, destroying every hut and every canoe. He didn't kill anybody, but he just led this campaign. This is all over a goat, a pregnant goat that had been, borrowed.
Oh, it was pregnant.
Yeah.
Okay, that's different.
Nanny goat. And they just didn't understand that it was a disproportionate answer to the crime. And his men, many of whom had been on the first and second voyage, said, "This isn't the same guy. What is wrong with him?" And I think they were puzzling over it, just like we historians and biographers have been puzzling over it all these years. It just didn't make sense.
Ship's doctor was the first to sort of see that, wasn't he? It wasn't the same guy. Yeah. Yeah. We're just going to have to live with that conundrum because it's never been resolved. Perhaps one of you would like to resolve.
Well, I was going to say something about his his interior life. If he had much interior life, he was from Yorkshire, and people from Yorkshire, of course, are kind of famously laconic and very direct and very practical people who know how to get things done, but don't necessarily, maybe he didn't write. He wrote millions of words, but he didn't write anything that you would call emotional. It was like emotionally unavailable, something like that. And then, he wrote these letters to whatever they had in their correspondence. His wife, who lived to be 90 years old, decided late in life to actually burn all the family papers. So why? Why did she? Why? There was this sort of cult of privacy back then. I think like you will never know about our family. So there's that, and then there's this other mystery in terms of the narrative record, and that is that although he wrote in his journal every single day religiously throughout the voyage, the day he sets foot on the Big Island of Hawaii, the last couple of weeks of his life, sorry, I think I gave away the end of the book. He dies, okay? But that very day that he sets foot on on the Big Island, and they seem to think that he is the returning god Lono, or certainly some kind of great dignitary, because they're bowing down to him, and he's all this stuff is really starting to happen. And for those last 2 weeks, the journal stops. We don't have, again, the interior life, what he might have been thinking or feeling or wondering about in those two very busy weeks of his life that happened to be the last weeks of his life. We don't know. And it's one of these great mysteries. It's a conspiracy theory. Most likely he did not stop journaling. It's most likely that someone ripped those pages out, or that the Admiralty censored him. I didn't know that. Something happened, and it's another thing that we historians are very frustrated about.
One of the startling things about it in the text of your book is it's probably the only moment of thorough indecision of his life. He's standing on the beach. He can't swim. He's surrounded by hostiles, and can't seem to make up his mind. And then they murder him. Yeah. And it's the most unlikely coda to his life. Yeah.
I mean, it was whatever his faults and shortcomings, he was an extremely disciplined explorer who held his his temper in check most of the time, almost all of the time when he encountered natives. He understood Polynesian culture better than any explorer at that time, and he spoke, as I mentioned earlier, some Polynesian language, and he thought he had a great relationship with the Hawaiians, and this thing escalated very, very quickly. And I won't go into all the sort of whys and wherefores, but it's a very complicated sort of Greek tragedy that takes place on the lava flats of the Big Island, Kealakekua Bay, and it's what's weird about it is that his men are all in the ship, except for some Marines who are trying to defend him. So they're all watching this unfold like a play or something against the backdrop of these sheer cliffs, and it's like an amphitheater almost. And they can't do anything about it. They're too far away to fire on the Hawaiians or get him out of there. And then you kind of buried the lead there when you said he can't swim. He could have turned around and jumped in the water and possibly have saved himself if he could swim. But this is unbelievable to me that people in the Royal Navy, people even in the American Navy many years later, were not required to learn how to swim. Their attitude was, well, you go overboard, you're going to probably die anyway, so just get it over with. And sink like a stone. So he did not know how to swim. This guy who had traveled the entire world on a ship did not.
Also, one of his lieutenants, Williams, I think his name was, declined to help.
Yeah, there's a whole other part of the story about one of the leaders of the Marines in one of the boats that was a little closer to the action wouldn't let his men fire, and why was he being a coward? Was he? This is a whole nother story, and they wanted to court-martial him. Somehow he kind of slipped out of that and had a checkered career after that. Let's put it that way. But yeah, it's quite a story, and it's perhaps one thing I was going to say about Captain Cook in America, in New Zealand, in Australia, in England. They all know who Captain Cook is. He's like not only their great explorer, but he's kind of a foundational character in the history of their nation, and they revere him for the most part. In America, I found while I was working on the book that people didn't really know who Captain Cook was, and all these people said to me, like, how's your book on the pirate coming along? And I was like, that's Captain Hook, or Captain Kirk, okay, Captain Crunch, some other captain. And I had to convince them, no, this was a great explorer, arguably the greatest nautical explorer of all time. And so I think that's why this book is maybe done as well as it has, is that most Americans don't know who the guy is. Right. And they're realizing all over again, wow, he was part of this larger world of exploration that was going on, that grew out of the Enlightenment, that was just fascinating, just unbelievably fascinating, and I think important to understand the modern world, how we got here. So
my wife's making signals about how to hold the microphone. And when I've done readings in the past, sometimes I get chatting with the audience, and I'll see her in the background going. So she does fantastic hand signals. My hat's off to her, actually. So just to diverge a little bit, if you don't mind, I was very interested in Clark, the captain of the Adventure, the other boat on this expedition, who seems to have been a sort of merrier soul in some ways than Cook, and beloved by his crew, pretty much, wasn't he? What was where did he come from? In fact, he was originally going to lead the expedition, wasn't he? And then Cook suddenly had a moment of envy, almost, it seemed. He said, "Don't worry, I'll do it." Right in the beginning.
Pretty much like that, yeah. Yeah, it's a little confusing. These two captains who were best friends and who had been together for all three of the voyages. Cook and Clark. But Clark was a little more, I would say, a lighthearted soul, jovial in many ways, much more beloved. I think they admired and revered and feared Captain Cook, but they preferred Clark. You know, he's the kind of guy you'd want to have a beer with. Clark also happened to be one of those guys that like to come ashore and fraternize with the locals, and something that Cook prided himself on never doing.
That was a big issue with all the crews, right? How long before we get to Tahiti?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to shock anyone here, but there's a lot of sex in this book. My editor at Doubleday is a Jesuit-trained Catholic and great editor, amazing editor, but he a little bit of a prude, and he kept making me take out the sex, and then my wife would tell me to put it back in.
Good old.
So we had a little bit of, to try to figure out how to turn this X-rated Voyage into a PG-13.
Well, my sense of it was when the crew would rush ashore to meet the Tahitian maidens, and Cook would hang back, and I thought, what's the matter with this guy?
Well, that's one of the many theories that are out there about what was wrong with Captain Cook. Was kind of a Freudian argument that just sexual abstinence for so long in the face of all of this stuff that was happening in Polynesia caused him to be what would be the term? It's repressed and sexually repressed. Whenever he got home, he and his wife would have a child exactly 9 months later. And then he'd go on another voyage. But back to Clark. So Clark was what's interesting about Clark is that and tragic is that he had contracted tuberculosis and didn't know it until deep into the voyage, and when it became inevitably obvious. And so you have this tired captain, and then you have this tubercular captain of the other ship, the Discovery. And I hate to tell you this, but after Cook dies, the voyage goes on for another year and a half, and then Clark dies, and is buried in Kamchatka in Russia. And so the third and final captain is named John Gore, and he brings the ships home successfully. He was born and raised in Virginia, and they had missed the memo on the American Revolution, or they knew that there was trouble in the colonies, but they had missed the Declaration of Independence, and just by a matter of weeks. So they get home and they find out this revolution's been going on for 4 years, and John Gore has to decide, what am I? Am I an American or am I a Brit? He decides to be British and stays that way. But several other Americans on board the ships make a beeline to the colonies and fight against the British. So it's an interesting, complicated, conflicted time in world history.
Would you say something about Omai, the Polynesian boy who was sort of what was the Virginia native woman who was kidnapped, taken to England? She died there. Pocahontas.
Like Pocahontas.
He was a sort of Polynesian Pocahontas, which is brought back as a sort of an example of the wildlife in the Western Hemisphere. And he was an extraordinarily adaptable character, wasn't he?
He was, and at times he almost kind of threatened to upstage the whole book and the whole story because I was so intrigued by him. So much so that I wrote a standalone book. There was an ebook that was published some years before this called The Exotic, and it's about Mai. And that story actually has recently been optioned to be a movie. Hollywood seems to be intrigued by Mai as much as England was back then. But the thing about him was, it was both kind of patronizing, like they wanted to bring him to England to study him, to see if he could prove the various theories about the noble savage and Rousseau and all this kind of stuff. But I think they genuinely fell in love with him, and he genuinely fell in love with England. He learned to hunt. He brought barbecue to England. That's where we get, Polynesian barbecue. He was apparently a mean backgammon player and chess player. He went to the Royal Society. He met King George. Interestingly, he was vaccinated for smallpox, because that's a problem. They usually would bring these people from native communities to England, and they would promptly die of smallpox. So he got vaccinated, and that worked for him. So it was a complicated kind of experiment in cross-pollination, but he was interested in coming to England primarily to get guns and learn how to use them and get ammunition, because he had some scores to settle back in Tahiti against the Bora Borans, who he hated. Right. And so he was playing the long game in a way. He knew what he wanted, and he got those things, by the way. Pretty amazing. And the other thing is, just before he left England, the greatest portrait painter in Europe at the time, a guy named Sir Joshua Reynolds, painted his portrait. It is it's his masterpiece. It's 8 feet tall, and he considered it his greatest painting. He kept it in his own private collection until he died. It was recently sold to the Getty Museum for $62 million, and it's this gorgeous thing. It's in the National Portrait Gallery right now. But so Mai's still famous. He's still a celebrity, and it's a cool painting.
That picture is in this beautifully produced book. Your publishers did an amazing job with this. They did. Are you happy with it?
I'm thrilled with it. It was kind of the golden age of not only portrait painting but also landscape painting by field artists. People who went with Cook, right. And so you get these gorgeous, rich color oil paintings that you couldn't reproduce them unless you go all the way on nice stock, and then they spent some money to make those things look nice. So and the maps are really good too. You can't do a book about Captain Cook, one of the greatest map makers of all time, and not have some pretty good maps, yep. which they did a good job with.
Well, let's see. He's dead. Okay, what more can we do?
Want to see if we have some questions out there?
Okay.
Anybody have a question? Here we go.
Thanks. I'd like to know a little bit more about how he gained access to one of the first Harrison chronometer watches, which was that was very, very early and breathtaking in terms of what it allowed him to do with his map making and chart making.
Yeah, the chronometer is its own story. It's, for the longest time, mariners had not known where they were in the world. They understood a little bit, about latitude, but longitude was something that was much harder to figure out. And there was this contest, I think that was paid for by Parliament and maybe by the Crown as well, and also sponsored by the Royal Society, to try to figure out how do you find longitude. And this guy Harrison, a clockmaker from Scotland, I believe, spent decades trying to perfect a seagoing clock that would tell exactly what time it was in Greenwich, England. That was the decided upon reference point. And then you compare that with various things wherever you are in the world at noon. You make some calculations and you're able to figure out longitude. The concept worked, but you had to build a clock that could withstand all the vicissitudes of sea travel. And so he built a clock, and then another clock was built that was a copy by a guy named Kendall. And these chronometers are all at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. Amazing. I mean, they're not kind of like the iPod or something of their time. They're just teeny little things about that big, and they worked, and they changed everything, because prior to that, you would go somewhere and you'd go back to your home port, and you couldn't say where you went. Like you sail south for a month, and then you sail east for 3 months, and you might find it. Now we know exactly where we are, and that accelerated everything, in terms of the maps, the accuracy of the maps, and the speed with which future explorers could return to those exact spots. And so he had that Kindle, the K1, on voyages 2 and 3, And it was really, really important. But, you had to keep them safe and high and dry. You had to wind them every day. You had to, really know how to use them and how to maintain them, which he did for both voyages.
There's a wonderful book about the discovery of longitude and
Dava Sobel, I think, was her name.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Dava is it?
Dava.
Dava Sobel. I really recommend it. It's just a fantastic book. And one of the first trials of it, they used it to sail to Cuba, and there was a forbidding coral reef that they'd always had trouble getting through. There's one little narrow passageway, and they relied on this chronometer to get them through there, and they just trusted it. They sailed straight away and shot this little gap in the thing and sailed into Havana Harbor. So if this topic interests you in the creation of this chronometer, which was extraordinary, wasn't it? And the dedication of Kendall. Was it Kendall the first guy to do it? He was the second.
Harrison was the one that
right.
showed that it could work, and then but his chronometer was very hard and expensive to build, and
right.
Kendall figured out how to sort of do a knockoff that was quicker to make and cheaper to make,
and handier to use, right? Yeah. And you can see these things if you go to the National Museum.
We have one over there, and then we'll come back here.
I'm only halfway through the book, but I don't hear much about William Bligh.
Yeah.
Well, I need to emphasize that this is not a biography of Captain Cook. I think of it really more as like a biography of a voyage, and like any voyage, it's an ensemble story with a lot of characters. And you mentioned Clark, and we have Mai, and we have Cook, of course, but we also have a lot of these young men who go on later in life to become very famous or infamous. Like we have George Vancouver, the young explorer. He was a midshipman at this time, will go on to become the great explorer of the Pacific Northwest. Vancouver Island, of course, is named after him, Vancouver, the city. And we have this insufferable young man who is an incredibly gifted map maker, just like Cook, and an incredible mariner named William Bligh, who will go on to infamy as part of this, of course, the great mutiny on the Bounty. So he's one of these guys that I think he was always right, but he was always the first to admit it. And people describe him as like being, he's correct, he's right about this, he's right about that, but they just didn't want to be around him for even 5 minutes. And imagine you're on a voyage for 4 years in very close quarters. Bligh crops up near the end more, especially when we get to Hawaii. There's no way to gainsay his competence, but he is kind of not necessarily a jerk exactly. He's just punctilious and, always, just, first to tell you how wrong you are and how right he was. And that those traits do reemerge, later in life. And then wasn't he a part of a mutiny even later in Australia, I think? So I think there were 2 mutinies visited upon him. So, something was wrong with the guy. Fascinating at the same time.
Yes, pardon this personal question, but at what point in your life did you realize that you have a penchant for writing that appeals to people?
Looking at it retrospectively or whatever, I really do think that meeting Shelby Foote, the Civil War historian, the guy with the beard and the pipe on the Ken Burns documentary, was a very important early encounter, because I saw in the flesh a writer who was writing that amazing trilogy of the Civil War, and I started to realize that there are these people who do this. They go back in their room and they commune with dead people for years and produce these thick books that people read. And he wasn't an academic. He was a novelist who became a historian. I'm sure it was important to me in multiple ways. We were his son and I were in a rock band in Memphis, and everyone thinks they're a musician in Memphis, and we we were not very good. And we're cranking up the Hendrix and cranking up the Pink Floyd, and Shelby he hated it. He hated our music, and he would come up on on the second floor where we were, and there's probably smoke wafting from the room, and he's like, Huggy. His son's name was Huggy. Huggy, I need you to turn that racket down. I'm working on Antietam. Yeah, and we're like, yeah, what's Antietam? Whatever. Many years later, with my first book, which was called Ghost Soldiers, it's a book about the Philippines in the World War II and prisoner of war camps that were run by the Japanese. And I asked Shelby to blurb my book, which is something writers hate to do. I very sheepishly asked him if he would blurb my book, and nothing happened. And finally, I got this really thick letter in the mail, handwritten from Shelby Foote, that said, basically, Hampton, I got your book, and I'm going to read it. I know it's going to be real good. I do declare, but I couldn't possibly blurb it. I have a policy. of not blurbing books. I've only blurbed 2 books in my entire life. And one of them was Cormac McCarthy, and the other was my dear friend Walker Percy. And he wrote this beautiful letter and wishing me well, and all this. I mean, it's like the time he took to write that letter. He could have written a blurb.
A little blurb.
Yeah. Anyway,
I had a fishing friend who I'm very fond of, who wrote me last week, and he said he was contemplating writing a book. But he wanted to know ahead of time if I would write a blurb for it.
Pre-blurb.
Pre-blurb.
But I think a number of things, like I was the editor of my 6th grade publication, Presbyterian Day School Presby. I was the editor of my high school newspaper. We were the Owls, so it was known as the Owls Hoot. I was an editor at Yale of a publication, a magazine. I guess I really thought I was going to be a journalist, and I was a kind of a journalist, a magazine journalist, for about 20 years, and I enjoyed that. I think it was a great education, and it was was wonderful. But I kept wanting to go longer and longer and longer, and finally got into writing these books. That seems to be where well, it's what I enjoy the most anyway, and people seem to be reading and buying the books, which is wonderful. But there is this kind of thing about historians, like, are you really a historian unless you have a PhD and are an academic? There's this kind of divide between popular and scholarly history, which is unfortunate, I think. But a lot of historians who are academics, unfortunately, their writing is deadly dull. It's like chloroform in print. It's like if where all these people pay money for gummies, to go to sleep, and all you need to do is get a academic history book, put it by your bedside, and you're asleep in like 1 minute. But I think unfortunately, it's really learning how to write like a great novelist or a short story writer. It's learning how to tell a story and make it work on the page, and using techniques that I guess are more.
I'm so glad that Hampton has put this glamorous glaze on the profession of writing. My favorite version of it, somebody asked Jean Cocteau, great French poet, what exactly should a writer do? And he thought and he thought, and he finally answered. He said, I think get dressed.
I think we have some questions over there.
There's a gentleman here too.
Oh, okay.
In
Oh, yeah.
Hi. So in the beginning of your book, you mentioned the most interesting American possibly on the boat, that John Ledyard. And I'm feeling a little guilty because I think I bought the last ticket and my husband's a direct descendant of John Ledyard. So I was hoping you might have something I could bring back to him as a little peace offering because he couldn't come. Didn't know.
Cannonball. Bring him a cannonball.
He was a cannibal? Perfect. I can see it. It comes down.
I don't have any relics, any physical relics, but he's certainly another one of the interesting characters on the boat. He on the ship. John Ledyard was from Connecticut. He went to Dartmouth. I think he got bored with the curriculum there. My wife went to Dartmouth. It's a great school, but he didn't seem to like it. He kind of skipped school, got in a canoe, and canoed the length of the Connecticut River, and then he decided to just quit school and go traveling around the world. And somehow he ended up as a Marine on this voyage, and was there, right there when Cook was killed, and wrote a book after he's one of the Americans who made a beeline to the colonies and wrote a book that became the very first book to be copyrighted in the United States about his voyage with Cook. And it was quite anti-British and anti-Cook because of the revolution. And it's very colorful. It's very well written and very interesting, although it does have some plagiarism problems too. Anyway, and then he went on to do other adventures. He walked from Paris all the way across Eurasia and was trying to walk all the way to Alaska. He was going to cross the Bering Strait, and he made it as far as like Irkutsk or Yakutsk, somewhere in basically Siberia, when Catherine the Great had him arrested as a spy. So then he went on another adventure. He was going to find the source of the Nile or the Congo or something, the Nile, and he died of poisoning in Cairo, unfortunately. America's great first adventurer, explorer. So I'm glad you asked about him. I'll think if I have any relics of his. I don't think I do. But real character, John Ledyard. Amazing. Is your husband also an adventurer? He likes to travel.
Bobby, he's had his hand up a lot.
Enthusiastic.
Just two positive things that I took from your book. When he was very young, and he was
only two positive things.
Oh, no. Well, it's getting late. In Newfoundland, I happened to see when I was visiting Newfoundland a small plaque to Cook, and he must have been in his late teens when he mapped Newfoundland. And you made a comment about you compare that today with satellite, and it was pretty close. But anyway, if you want to talk to that, and the other one was all the places he saw, and he was idolized in England. He never named a place after himself or his family, and yet we've all heard of the Cook Islands and the Cook Inlet and so on. Those two items, if you'd comment.
Yeah. So he rose very quickly up through the ranks of the Navy, primarily because they recognized that he had this uncanny skill for making maps, and often he would just do it on the fly while he was in a boat, just a little bit of guesswork. But he spent three summer seasons in Newfoundland. They had basically, kicked the French out of North America, and they wanted to, properly map their new possessions and so forth. And so they sent him over there to do Newfoundland, and you superimpose the satellite map over the top of it, and it's just chillingly accurate. It's like, with the kind of crude tools that he had to work with, it's exact. And he also made a map of New Zealand, North and South Island, that was used for 150 years as like the definitive map until they, got people more on the ground. So that was his real skill. And the other thing about not naming anything after himself, like it was the prerogative of explorers back then to just name things after your son, your daughter, your wife, yourself, and he just didn't do that ever. And now we'll see his name on everything, but that came later. Mount Cook, Cook Strait, Cook Inlet. There's craters on the moon named after him. But that came after. And that kind of modesty, that kind of humility was genuine to his personality. It had partly to do with his modest upbringing. He came up through the ranks from complete poverty, self-taught. He was trained under Quakers. I guess he grew up with a lot of really good oatmeal. And he was just one of these genuinely humble guys.
And don't laugh. She laughs at everything you say, including that moronic oatmeal.
As a person who's what?
Close to your mouth.
Oh, okay. Having read a number of books about this early exploration and all, I was struck at the parallels between Magellan and Cook.
Yeah.
I mean, both being killed by natives at the near the end of their voyage, both having encountered native women who provided all sorts of diversion to the crew. Magellan in Rio, essentially, and but I wonder, from your perspective, whether you could compare them.
Well, another really positive thing about Captain Cook was that he recognized the people who came before him, and understood who the great ones were, and read about them, and honored their nomenclature whenever they had labeled something. He kept that name. He didn't just rename it like Gulf of America. He was very conscious of what came before, and I think that was great. And so he specifically wrote about Magellan some. He understood that Magellan, although he didn't return home, his voyage was the first, I think, to circumnavigate the globe as far as we know, and he did it with much cruder tools. And he didn't have that chronometer and a lot of other tools. So he thought Magellan was a greater sailor than he was. Cook didn't think he was a great sailor. He thought I think he understood that he was a great map maker, and that he was a very good sort of leader of men. And like, for example, not a single person died of scurvy on Captain Cook's voyage. All three of them. Which he kind of had an intuitive understanding of, like something about fresh food, and how important it was to combat scurvy. So, but I don't think he thought it was just in terms of just pure navigation that he was as good as Magellan, but rather, he's almost like a cyborg. Like, people have compared Captain Cook to Captain Kirk, but he was really more like Spock. He was methodical, and he had these great tools, and he was very vigilant and kind of just organized, scientific about the way he sailed. Magellan was, I think, more emotional and more dramatic, and but the other thing is that Captain Cook was quite well aware of how Magellan died. And he said repeatedly, as he went from island to island to island, like, I'm not going to get involved in these local conflicts. I'm not going to, because they're constantly wanting him to side with one tribal one tribe against another, because you have these amazing things called guns. And he would decline every time. He did not want to die in the way that Magellan did, and yet here's what happened, on that day, Valentine's Day, 1779. So it's an interesting comparison. What do I think? I don't know. I think Magellan may have been, again, the greater mariner, and the Cook was the greater kind of all-around explorer and manager of a large enterprise. Because what they brought back in these voyages is just beyond compare. I was like, just the science, the descriptions, the art, the maps, publishing everything. It's extraordinary if you look at the whole voyage and all the people that were on board. I don't know that there's anything quite like it in the annals of exploration history. So that's what I think. What do I know?
Well, you studied it for how many years did it take you, Hampton, to research this book?
Yeah. I've recently gotten to be friends with another Memphis writer, fairly well known and fairly productive writer named John Grisham. And and he gives me shit. He's like, what's your problem? You take 4 or 5 years to write these books, and I write one every 6 months. And I said, well, the difference is, you just make stuff up, and I have to research all this stuff, and it all has to be true. So I am slower than he is. He's a very disciplined writer, but I think the main thing is the research is what takes the longest. The travel, the go into the archives, fact checking. If you make a mistake in the category of nautical stuff, architecture, for example, you call it a sprit and it's actually a spar, or you're destroyed. I mean, they're just not going to read you. We can't trust a word this guy has to say. And so you got to get it right. And so you have to have. I mean, I think one of the things that narrative historian or any kind of historian has to have is a kind of a high tolerance for tedium, for long periods of time. 2, 3, 4 years. You have to stick with it till it's done, and it takes a long time. So.
Well, I just want to say, I know people have been talking about this book. A lot of people here have already read it, and now they'll all get to read it. And I just want to thank you so much for being here with us today, and thank you, Tom, for creating such a great conversation with Hampton. We are really among great writers here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you.